Brian's Winter by Gary Paulson, illustrated by Roel Cologne. 13-year-old Brian Robeson is alone in the Canadian wilderness. Several months before, he had been in a plane crash after the pilot suffered a heart attack at the controls. Brian had retrieved from the plane a survival pack that helped him get through summer and fall. But now he faces a harsh winter and spends all day making preparations. He has weatherproofed his small shelter near a lake and busies himself with making a bow and arrows and practicing his aim. Despite Brian's many hardships, he considers himself lucky to find a deer carcass. In his shelter, he stores the deer meat left behind by wolves. By dark this day, all 9 arrows were finished. Brian had used the hunting knife as a scraper to shape the limbs of the bow more equally, and to put in notches for the string to get it ready to string the next day for the first shooting trials. He was just leaning back, half cocky about how well things were going, when he smelled the skunk. He had run into skunks before, of course, saw them all the time, but had only had the one really bad experience when he got sprayed directly. He knew that moved all at night hunting, and didn't seem very afraid of anything. He looked out of the shelter opening carefully. The skunk wasn't 4 feet away, looking in at him at the shelter and the fire as he watched. It whipped up its rear end and tipped its tail over and aimed directly at his face. "I'm dead," he thought, and froze. For a long time they stayed that way, Brian holding his breath, waiting to be nailed, and the skunk aiming at him. But the skunk didn't spray, just aimed and held it. "He's hungry," Brian thought. "That's all. He's hunting, and he's hungry." Slowly Brian reached to his right, where the meat was stored back in the corner, and took a piece of the venison. With a smooth, slow movement, he tossed the meat out to the right of the skunk. For a split second he thought it was over. The skunk's tail jerked when the meat hit the ground, but then its nose twitched as it smelled it, and it lowered its tail, turned, and started eating the meat. Brian carefully reached out to the side and pulled the door back over the opening and left the skunk outside eating. "Great," he thought, crawling back into his bag to sleep. "If I quit feeding him, he'll spray me. Just great." His eyes closed, and he sighed. Maybe he'll be gone in the morning. In the morning he pushed the door to the side gingerly, looking both ways. He didn't see the skunk, and he pushed the door all the way open and went outside. Still no skunk. Before heading back for the trench he had dug for a toilet, he pulled the door back over the opening, no sense taking chances, and then trotted off into the woods. When he came back, he looked all around the area and still couldn't see the skunk, and he shrugged. It must have moved on. He kindled an outside fire using coals from the shelter fire, and soon had a small cooking fire going. The cold lasted longer now into the morning, and the ice had moved farther out into the lake, almost 40 feet from the shore all around. The rabbit-skin vest and the fire felt especially good. He took the last of the jellied meat in the pot, added a piece of red venison, and put it on the side of the fire to cook while he took stock of his situation. The shelter was done, or as done as he could get it, and almost airtight and warm when he had a fire going inside. He had 9 arrows finished, which seemed like a lot. How many times would he have to defend himself? Besides, even if he had used all the arrows, he could get more tips from the arrow stone, and the wood shafts would be there in the winter as well. Winter. The word stopped him. He knew nothing about it. At home in upstate New York there was snow, sometimes a lot of it, and cold at times, cold enough to make his ears sting, but he could get inside, and he had a good warm clothes. Here, he suspected, the winter would be a lot worse, but he didn't know how much worse or how to prepare for it. Just then the meat was done, and at exactly that moment, as he pulled the pot off the fire, the skunk came waddling around the end of the rock, stopped 4 feet away, and raised its tail. "What?" Brian winced, waiting. But the skunk did not spray, and Brian took a piece of meat from the pot and threw it on the ground next to it. The skunk lowered its tail, smelled the meat, and when it proved too hot to eat, it backed away and raised its tail again. "Listen, you little robber, I'm sorry it's too hot. You'll just have to wait until it cools." The skunk kept its tail up, but lowered it a bit and seemed to understand, and in a moment, when the meat cooled, it picked up the chuck chunk and disappeared with it under and around the corner of the large rock that was the back wall of Brian's shelter. "Where are you going?" Brian stood up and followed at a distance, but moving slowly, and when he came around the rock the skunk was completely gone, disappeared. But Brian walked all around the end, back again, and was on his second loop when he saw some grass wiggling at the edge where the rock met the ground. The grass here was thick and about a foot tall and hid the dirt from view. Brian moved closer and saw some fresh earth and a hole beneath the rock, and as he watched he saw black and white fur moving down inside the hole. "You're living here?" Brian shook his head. You've moved in on me?" The skunk stopped moving inside for a moment, then started again, and while Brian watched, little spurts of dirt came out of the entrance as the skunk dug back in under the rock. Brian turned away. "Wonderful! I've got a roommate with a terminal hygiene problem." Inside of the 4 days a routine was established. The skunk came to the entrance in the morning, flicked its tail in the air, and waited to be fed. Brian fed it, and it went back to its burrow until the next morning. It wasn't exactly friendship, but soon Brian smiled when he saw the skunk. He named it Betty after deciding that it was a female and that it looked like his aunt, who was low and round and waddled the same way. He looked forward to seeing it. After developing the acquaintance with the skunk, Brian had gone back to work on the heavy bow. The arrows were done, but he had yet to string the bow and was stymied on where to get a string, long enough until he saw the cord at the end of the sleeping bag. It was braided nylon, 1/8 of an inch thick and close to 6 feet long, enough to go around the bag twice when it was rolled up. The cord was sewn into the end of the bag, but he sharpened the knife on his sharpening rock and used the point to open the stitching enough to free the cord. It proved to be difficult to string the bow. In spite of his scraping and shaping, the limbs were still very stout, and the bow bent only with heavy pressure. He tied the string to one end, then put the tied end in a depression in a rock on the ground, and used his weight to pull down the top end while he tied the cord in place. It hummed when he plucked it, and the strength of the wood seemed to sing in the cord. He took 4 of the arrows and moved to a dirt hummock near the lake shore. He put an arrow in the bow and fitted it to the string, raised the bow and looked down the shaft at the target and drew the arrow back. Or tried to. When it was halfway to his chin, the bow seemed to double in strength, and he was shaking with the exertion by the time he got the feathers all the way back, and the cord seemed to be cutting through his fingers. He released quickly, before he had time to aim properly, and saw the arrows crease the top of the hummock, skip onto the lake ice, jump off the ice, and fly across the open water in the middle and land skittering across the ice on the far side of the lake, a good 200 yards. At the same time, the string slapped his arm so hard it seemed to tear the skin off, and the rough front end of the feathers cut the top of his hand as they passed over it. Wow! He could not see the arrow, but he knew where it had gone, and would walk around the lake later and retrieve it. Now he had to practice. He changed the angle he was shooting at, so the arrows wouldn't go across the lake if he missed. When he missed, he thought, smiling, and moved closer to the hummock. It was hard to judge the strength of the pull of the bow. He guessed 50-60 pounds of pull were required to get the string back to his chin, and every shot hurt his arm and fingers and hand. But it was worth it. The arrows left the bow so fast that he couldn't see them fly, and they hit so hard that 2 of them drove on through the hummock and kept going for 15 or 20 yards and broke the stone tips. He made new tips that night, and it was while he was making them that he knew he would be hunting bigger game. It was strange how the thought came, or how it just seemed to be there. He had made the bow for protection, had thought only in terms of protection all the while he was making arrows, but somewhere along the way the knowledge that he would use it to hunt was just there. Maybe it was eating the meat from the doe that had done it. There was so much of it, and it tasted so good and was easier to deal with than the smaller animals. Whatever the reason, when he aimed at the hummock to practice, he saw the chest of a deer. He shot all that day until his shoulders were sore, and he had broken an arrow and 2 more tips by hitting small rocks along the ground. Then at dark he built a fire, cooked some meat, fed Betty, who arrived just as the meat was done, and retired to the shelter to fix arrows. He would hunt big tomorrow, he thought. He would try to get a deer. He didn't know the time, but somewhere in the middle of the night he awakened suddenly. He had come to rely on his senses, and he knew something had changed to snap him awake that way, and he lay with his eyes wide in the dark, listening, smelling, trying to see. He did not have long to wait. There was a soft rustle, then a woofing sound, and the whole wall of the shelter peeled away from the rock as if caught in an earthquake, away and down, and Brian, still in his bag, was looking up in the dark at an enormous form of a bear leaning over him. There was no time to react, to move, to do anything. Meat, Brian had time to think. He smelled the venison and come for it. He's come for the meat. And it was true. The bear had come for the meat, but the problem was that Brian lay between the bear and the meat, and the bear cuffed him to the side. As it wasn't much of a cuff, nowhere near what the bear could have done, which would have broken Brian's legs, but the bag was zipped, and Brian became tangled in it and couldn't move fast enough to stay out of the way, so the bear hit him again. This time hard. The blow took Brian in the upper thigh, and even through the bag it was solid enough to nearly dislocate his hip. He cried out, "Ah!" The bear stopped dead in the darkness. Brian could see the head turn to look back and down at him. A slow turning, huge and full of threat, and the bear's breath washed over him, and he thought, "I am going to die now. All this that I have done, and I'm going to die because a bear wants to eat, and I am in the way." He could see the bear's teeth as it showed them, and he simply couldn't do anything, couldn't move, couldn't react. It was over. The bear started to move down toward Brian, and then hesitated, stopped, and raised its head again, and turned to look back over its shoulder to the left. Half a beat, and Brian lay still, staring up at the bear. But now a new smell. Over the smell of the bear, a rank, foul, sulphurous, and gagging smell, as the bear turned and took a full shot of skunk spray directly in the eyes. Betty had arrived. Whether she'd just been hunting and had come back, or had been awakened and surprised, or simply didn't like bears very much, whatever the reason, she had dumped a full load in the bear's face. The effect was immediate and devastating. Roar! The bear seemed to turn inside itself, knocking Brian farther to the side, and rolled backward out of the shelter area, slamming its head back and forth on the ground, trying to clear its eyes, hacking and throwing up as it vanished in the night. Brian looked to the source of all this. Betty stood near the end of the shelter, still with her tail raised, only now aimed at Brian. She twitched it once, then again, and Brian shook his head. "I'm sorry, I just didn't think you'd be thinking of food." He took a piece of meat from the pile, a big one, and tossed it to her, and she lowered her tail, picked up the meat, and waddled off into the dark in the direction of her burrow. Brian lay back in his bag. His shelter was a mess. The wall tipped over, and his hip hurt, but it wasn't raining, and the bag was warm. He could fix things up in the morning. The stink of the skunk was everywhere. Much of what Betty had shot at the bear had gone around it and hit the wall, but Brian didn't mind. In fact, he thought, "I've grown kind of fond of it. I'll have to make sure to give her extra food." It was like having a pet nuclear device. He went to sleep smiling.